Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Wendy Bacon, who is a well-known journalist, academic, thinker, intellectual, need I go on. Wendy.
Thank you, Anthony. Look, I'm speaking here today as the Director of the Australian Centre for Independent Journalism at UTS. Just a very small gesture. We've invited Julian Assange to become an honorary member of the ACIJ. I don't think that will help him a lot where he sits. Probably the Australian government could lend a bit more of a hand, but nevertheless, it's just a sign of support. Now, it's really interesting, and I'm sure it's occurred to all of you, that the whole of the state's resources and our Prime Minister and everyone else has been at hand to present Oprah to the Australian public. And yet the police have seen fit to ban a demonstration or ban a march in case we actually obstruct anyone.
Shame!
This says so much about our style of democracy, I think, and very much goes to the heart of Wikileaks. Our democracy is about spectacle, spin and secrecy. Now, some of you, many of you, will not remember the days when you didn't need a permit to march. And then there came along days, I think towards the end of the 1970s, when suddenly it was suggested that you did need a permit to march. And one of the very big mistakes we made back then in giving away our rights is that people ended up going along with what is in fact something we should not have to do. There are some things more important than obstructing a few people on their way home from work. But this is nothing really, and it's just one in what will be an endless attempts, arguments to sidetrack, confuse and obliterate the powerful effects of Wikileaks. And I think our job as supporters is to go beyond, and I will talk a little bit about that, about the, what hopefully aren't cliches about freedom of expression, but so often become cliches. What we need to do is go beyond that and see that Wikileaks actually counts for something and hold the people accountable for the crimes and the duplicity exposed accountable to the extent to which we can. Now, it's no secret to any of us, and I know certainly to those of you here, that our foreign policy is based on lies. Many of you were there back in when we had hundreds and thousands of people in the streets opposing the war in Iraq. And I think it was a profoundly depressing moment for us all when that war went ahead, despite the fact of the millions around the world who didn't want it to happen. And some of the results of that, we've all seen them through Wikileaks. But I think what that did was actually leave many of us with a feeling of, to some extent, powerlessness. For my generation, we'd always believed that to some extent our demonstrations, our small actions around the war in Vietnam did help bring that war to a close. We played a part at least. What the war in Iraq meant is that somehow that was no longer possible with the power of people in the street. It's up to us to change that, and I think in the process of changing it, Wikileaks can be a significant moment. Now, by the way, has anyone asked Oprah what she thinks about Wikileaks? Can I suggest, if there's any journalists here, if anyone gets anywhere near her, you should. She might just support it. I don't know. I tried to find it on Google, but I couldn't. Now, look, I agree with many of the things that Anthony said about the media and journalists, but this has been one moment when you do feel proud to be a journalist. Assange says he's a journalist, but also there's those journalists, particularly at The Guardian and the Bureau of Investigative Reporting in London, who did the work that journalists are supposed to do. They sifted through the information, they put it into stories, and they made it make sense to people. And that is what the journalists should be doing, not reporting government and corporate spin, and so much of that has also been exposed by Wikileaks. Now, there are those decriers, of course, and there always will be. There's the really cynical ones who say, oh, we knew it all. Well, if we did, why didn't we do something? It's so, and if we did, why didn't we tell more people? If in fact we did it, if we have learned, like the citizens in the Soviet could do, to read between the lines, to somehow know what's happening despite the lies, well, why didn't we as journalists tell everybody else? And then there are those, like Tanya Plebiscite, very disappointing, the member for Sydney. I thought she would do better than that, particularly when other members of the left came out, but being in Cabinet is a heavy act. And to suggest that somehow this is illegal or that it's illegal because it was somehow classified is to deny the entire history of civil disobedience, whistleblowing and all the actions that have actually founded any sort of democracy in the first place. And just a legal point or two. I hope that most of you here, I'm sure you have watched the video Collateral Damage. That is profoundly disturbing to watch people, what has happened to those human beings, who has done what to them to put them in a position when they are prepared to revel in the shooting of innocent people. But anyone, so they are guilty of murder, but anyone, they said that everybody knew about these cables. They were spread to thousands of people. Well, some of you may have heard of an offence called misprision, a felony. It's when you fail to disclose a felony that you know has been committed. So any politician, any person in our intelligence services, anyone else who saw that, who knew about it, who failed to act, to do something, are themselves guilty of a crime. So let's not talk... not talk about legality. There is no doubt where the legality lies in this case, and anything else is just confusing, attempts to confuse the public. Now, there's lots of lies. There's the lies, as Anthony said, about Sri Lanka. While that war was going on in Sri Lanka, our government was accepting propaganda, the media were accepting the government's propaganda. If in fact there were cables and diplomatic evidence that war crimes were being committed, once again, why did the Australian government go along with it? And then of course there are the corporate acts. Can we really, it's quite amazing to me actually, which I know might sound naive, that Rio Tinto, they actually put out a pretty good campaign that they thought Stern Hugh might be innocent. And all of that, of course, just fueled anti-Chinese feeling. I'm not saying that China does not deny freedom. What I am saying is that fuels the demonisation of China. And what do we now read in Wikileaks? That is that all along they were feeding the evidence. They had the evidence that Stern Hugh was in fact involved in crimes. And so this major corporation, which funds, sponsors, all sorts of things, just remember before we accept their sponsorship that they are themselves liars. And then there is Rudd. Rudd's attempted to cover himself in glory this week. He'll have some say over Assange's passport. Oh, he thinks everybody else is getting overexcited about WikiLeaks. Well, before we let him off the hook, let's just remember that while he was saying he was opposed to the US ballistic missile system that will in fact accelerate global tensions, he was in fact supporting it. Before we get overexcited about his support, let's hold him to account for that. So just to finish, there has been a lot said about the importance of information for a democracy, and WikiLeaks actually rests on that idea. And I'll just read you one quote from the Pentagon Papers case, which was in my generation the case that stood in our minds for the importance of seeing through the classified documents, seeing through the confidentiality, seeing through the claims for national security. That established that well for us. but as the judges said in the Supreme Court of the US in the Pentagon Papers, the only effective restraint upon executive power in the areas of national defence and international affairs may lie in an enlightened citizenry, in informed and critical public opinion which can alone protect the values of democratic government. But what I would just end by saying, I think we have to say enlightenment is not enough. What are we going to do with the enlightenment? And to say that we have to make some changes not only in our foreign policy but well beyond that. Thank you.
I just have three very short announcements. The first one is I've just been told that in Melbourne there are 1,000 people protesting and growing, which is great news. Secondly, that there are buckets going around for donations, so feel free to dig deep. And thirdly, initially this rally was going to be a march to the US consulate. When there was a discussion about it earlier on today with the police, they essentially said that because of Oprah, not enough resources. Interesting. Then, now we're basically in negotiation to work out whether it's going to happen or not. The question is, from the crowd, do you guys want to march? That's inconclusive, okay. Our next speaker is Marcus Strong from the MEAA, which is the journalist union in Australia. Marcus.
I don't think that will help him a lot where he sits. Probably the Australian government could lend a bit more of a hand, but nevertheless, it's just a sign of support. Now, it's really interesting, and I'm sure it's occurred to all of you, that the... Thank you, Anthony. Look, I'm speaking here today as the Director of the Australian Centre for Independent Journalism at UTS. Just a very small gesture. We've invited Julian Assange to become an honorary member of the ACIJ.
Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Wendy Bacon, who is a well-known journalist, academic, thinker, intellectual, need I go on. Wendy.
The whole of the state's resources, and our Prime Minister and everyone else, has been at hand to present Oprah to the Australian public. And yet the police have seen fit to ban a demonstration